The briefing room at Bagram Airfield fell silent when the mission parameters flashed across the screen. 12 Navy SEALs trapped in a valley the Afghans called the Throat of God, surrounded by 200 Taliban fighters who'd been planning this ambush for months. 3 Chinooks shot down attempting extraction. 4 Apache gunships driven back by concentrated anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a steel curtain. The valley was a kill box, and everyone in that room knew it. The air mission commander stood at the podium, his jaw tight, scanning faces for someone crazy enough to volunteer. That's when Captain Marcus Reaper Kine stood up from the back row, his weathered A-10 Thunderbolt patch visible on his flight suit. He was 42 years old, a single father of twin girls, and he'd been flying the Warthog for 19 years. The silence that followed wasn't respect. It was calculation. Everyone knew Reaper's reputation, and it wasn't entirely positive. The thing about Marcus Kine was that he'd washed out of fighter pilot training 12 years ago, failed the precision bombing tests, couldn't handle the G-forces in the F-16 simulator, got reassigned to the A-10 program, which most pilots considered a consolation prize. The Warthog wasn't sexy. It was slow, ugly, armored like a tank, and built around a cannon so powerful it could shred buildings. It was close air support, the infantry's guardian angel, the plane you flew when you couldn't fly anything else. And Reaper had taken that rejection and turned it into something darker. He flew like he had nothing to lose, putting his aircraft into angles that made maintenance crews pray, getting so close to enemy positions that he'd return with branches stuck in his landing gear. His wingmen requested transfers. His commanding officers wrote him up for reckless endangerment. But he always brought his plane home, and he always protected the ground troops, and that created a strange, untouchable status that everyone resented. Now he stood in that briefing room, volunteering for what amounted to a suicide mission, and the younger pilots exchanged glances. The air mission commander looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what you're flying into, Captain?" Reaper's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "I understand those men are dying, sir." The commander nodded slowly, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with protocol. "Then you're cleared for immediate launch. Call sign Reaper 1. May God go with you." Marcus walked out of that briefing room knowing he might never see his daughters again. What he didn't know was that this mission would redefine everything the military understood about courage, sacrifice, and the terrifying beauty of a pilot who'd finally found something worth dying for. The pre-flight check took 11 minutes, and Marcus performed it with the methodical precision of a man who'd done this dance 1,000 times. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a predator at rest, its twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, its titanium bathtub cockpit gleaming dully in the Afghan sun. The maintainers had loaded her with full combat payload, 1,100 rounds of 30mm depleted uranium in the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, 2 AIM-9 Sidewinders for self-defense, and 14 Mark 82 500-pound bombs. The aircraft was a flying arsenal, 30 tons of armored fury designed for one purpose: getting close enough to the enemy to look them in the eyes before destroying them. Marcus climbed into the cockpit, his hands moving through switches and dials with practiced efficiency. Radio check, hydraulics, flight controls, weapon systems, everything green. He caught his reflection in the canopy glass for a moment, a weathered face, lines around the eyes from squinting into hostile skis, a jaw that hadn't relaxed in years. Taped to his instrument panel was a photograph of his twin daughters, Emma and Sophie, age 7, wearing matching pink dresses at their school concert. Their mother had died in a car accident 4 years ago, leaving him alone to navigate bedtime stories and scraped knees and parent-teacher conferences between deployments. He touched the photo once, gently, then his hand moved to the throttle. Tower, Reaper 1 requesting clearance for immediate combat departure. Reaper 1, you are cleared hot. Godspeed, Captain. The engine spooled up with that distinctive turbofan whine, and Marcus felt the familiar vibration through his seat, through his bones. He released the brakes and the Warthog began to roll, gathering speed, the runway blurring beneath him. At 140 knots, he pulled back on the stick, and the nose lifted, the ground falling away, Afghanistan spreading out below him in shades of brown and gray and death. He banked southwest toward the Hindu Kush Mountains, toward the valley where 12 men were counting their remaining ammunition and making peace with whatever god they believed in. The flight to the target area took 18 minutes. Marcus kept his altitude low, following the terrain, using the mountain ridges for cover. The A-10 wasn't built for speed. Its maximum velocity was about half that of a modern fighter jet, but it was built for survival. The titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit could withstand direct hits from 23mm cannon fire. The redundant flight control systems meant you could lose half the aircraft and still fly home. The engines were positioned to minimize infrared signature and protect against ground fire. It was a plane designed by people who understood that close air support meant getting shot at, a lot, and still completing the mission. His radio crackled to life. "Reaper 1, this is Sabre 26, how copy?" The voice was strained, punctuated by gunfire in the background. Marcus recognized the tone of a man who'd already written his last letters home. "Sabre 26, Reaper 1, I copy you 5x5. Give me your situation." "We're in a dried riverbed, grid November Victor 734821. Surrounded on 3 sides, taking heavy fire from reinforced positions on the ridge lines. We've got 2 urgent surgical, 4 priority wounded. We're down to 40% ammo. They're moving mortars into position. Estimate we have maybe 20 minutes before they can drop indirect on our heads." Marcus pulled up his tactical display, fingers dancing across the multifunction displays. The valley appeared in green wireframe, narrow, steep-sided, a natural ambush site that had probably claimed lives for 1,000 years. The SEAL team was pinned at the bottom, enemy positions marked in red clusters along the high ground. It was a textbook kill zone, the kind of situation that had unwinnable written across it in blood. "Sabre 26, I'm 3 minutes out. I need you to mark your position with IR strobes and get everyone's heads down. When I come in, I'm coming in low and loud." "Reaper 1, be advised the valley is hot. We've counted at least 6 ZU-23 anti-aircraft positions and multiple MA and PADS teams. 3 Apache already turned back. They're waiting for air support. They're ready for you." Marcus's voice dropped an octave, became something colder. "Then let's not disappoint them." He pushed the throttle forward and the Warthog accelerated, still hugging the terrain, threading through mountain passes that would make any sane pilot reconsider their career choices. The Hindu Kush rose around him like the bones of the earth, peaks still capped with snow even in summer, valleys filled with shadows that had hidden warriors since Alexander's time. His hands were steady on the controls, his breathing even, but in his mind he was already flying the attack run, visualizing angles and timing, calculating the impossible geometry of survival. The valley opened before him suddenly, and Marcus's first thought was that Sabre 26 had undersold the situation. The dried riverbed twisted through the center like a scar, and along both ridge lines he could see the enemy position sandbagged bunkers, heavy weapons emplacements, fighters moving with the disciplined coordination of trained soldiers. This wasn't some ragtag insurgent force. This was a prepared ambush by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And at the bottom of that valley, visible as tiny IR strobes on his targeting display, were 12 Americans who'd run out of options. The first anti-aircraft gun opened up when he was still 2 miles out. Green tracers arced across his canopy, beautiful and lethal, seeking his aircraft with mechanical patience. Marcus banked hard right, rolled inverted, pulled through, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. More guns joined in, creating a lattice of fire that turned the air solid. A proximity warning shrieked in his headset missile launch, infrared seeking, coming fast from his 7 o'clock. He punched flares and dove toward the deck, the missile tracking the thermal decoys and detonating 100 feet behind him, close enough that the shockwave buffeted his aircraft like a giant slap. Reaper 1 is taking fire, engaging now. He rolled wings level and dropped into the valley, airspeed bleeding off to 250 knots, altitude so low he could see individual fighters turning to track him. This was what the A-10 was built for: the merge, the close fight, the ugly brutal work that happened when you were near enough to see faces. His thumb found the weapons select, cycling to the GAU-8. The cannon was the Warthog's true weapon, 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, firing projectiles the size of Coke bottles that could punch through tank armor. When you fired it, the entire aircraft shuddered, slowed by the recoil, as if God himself was saying no. Marcus squeezed the trigger. The sound was like the universe tearing in half, a sustained BRRRT that echoed off the valley walls and redefined violence. The first bunker on the ridgeline simply ceased to exist, replaced by a cloud of dust and spinning fragments. He walked the fire across the slope, each burst precise and devastating, seeing positions that had stood for hours disintegrate under the depleted uranium rain. The Taliban fighters broke and ran, and Marcus felt no satisfaction, only the cold clarity of the mission. He pulled up hard, engines screaming, tracers following him like angry hornets, and banked for another pass. Sabre 2-6, Reaper 1, first pass complete, assessing damage and coming back around. How's your situation? Reaper 1, you just bought us breathing room. North Ridge is suppressed, but the South Ridge is still active. We've got mortars setting up at grid November Victor 736844. Marcus checked his tactical display, already lining up the geometry. The mortar position was tucked behind a rock outcropping, protected from direct fire. He'd need to come in from the west, drop angle 45 degrees, release the Mavericks in terminal guidance mode, and pray the seeker heads could find the target. It was a low-percentage shot under the best circumstances. These weren't the best circumstances. He set up the approach, fingers moving across controls with the unconscious precision of muscle memory. The A-10 responded like an extension of his body, banking through the mountain passes, trading altitude for position. The anti-aircraft fire intensified, tracking him now, the gunners adjusting their aim. A 23mm round punched through his left wing, leaving a hole you could throw a basketball through. Warning lights flickered on his panel. Marcus ignored them. The Warthog could take punishment that would down any other aircraft. It was built by pessimists who assumed everything would go wrong. Reaper 1 missile launch. MANPADS, your 3 o'clock. He saw it, a white contrail rising from the southern ridge, heat-seeker locked on his engines. Marcus chopped throttle and banked hard into the threat, breaking the missile's tracking solution, punching more flares. The Sidewinder streaked past, close enough that he felt the heat through the canopy. No time to celebrate. He rolled back level, acquired the mortar position on his targeting display, and selected AGM-65. Magnum. 2 Mavericks dropped from the wing pylons, motors igniting, seeker heads locked on the infrared signature of the mortar position. They streaked downward, terminal velocity, and Marcus was already banking away when they impacted. The explosion was massive, secondary detonations as stored mortar rounds cooked off, a fireball that climbed 200 feet into the Afghan sky. The southern ridge went silent. But Marcus had bigger problems. His master caution light was illuminated, hydraulic pressure dropping on the primary system, fuel leak detected in the left wing tank. He checked his gauges, fuel at 70% and falling, hydraulics at 40%, flight controls sluggish. The A-10 was tough, but it wasn't invincible. He'd taken more damage than he'd realized, and the valley was still full of people trying to kill him. Sabre 2-6, Reaper 1, mortar position destroyed. What else you got for me? Reaper 1, you're leaking fuel. We can see it from down here. You need to egress. Marcus's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Negative, give me targets. There was a pause, and when the SEAL team leader spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been respect. Western Ridge, heavy weapons bunker, grid November Victor 735839. It's got clear fields of fire on our position. We can't move until it's suppressed." Marcus brought the A-10 around for another pass, fighting the sluggish controls, compensating for the fuel imbalance. The Western Ridge bunker was dug in deep, reinforced concrete and sandbags, probably built by Soviet engineers decades ago. He'd need to get the cannon on target, close range, precision fire, which meant flying directly into the remaining anti-aircraft fire, which meant accepting that he might not pull out of this run. He thought of his daughters, their faces at breakfast that morning, the way Emma had hugged him too tight and Sophie had pretended not to care. He thought of the photograph taped to his instrument panel. And then he stopped thinking and became the machine, the weapon, the instrument of deliverance for 12 men who were depending on him to do the impossible. The Warthog dove into the valley one more time. The bunker's heavy machine gun opened up when Marcus was still 800 meters out, 50 caliber rounds that could saw a man in half, walking toward his aircraft with patient inevitability. He jinked left, right, keeping the Warthog dancing, making himself a harder target. 600 meters, 400. The gun grew larger in his heads-up display, muzzle flashes bright as stars. 200 meters. He could see the gunner now, a man in a Packall hat, face set with determination, pouring fire at the American warplane that refused to die. Marcus centered the Pipper, compensated for wind and angle and the wounded aircraft's drift, and opened fire. The GAU-8 spoke its terrible language again, 3-second burst, 70 rounds, each one following the last with perfect precision. The bunker's roof exploded, then its walls, then the ground around it, everything caught in the depleted uranium storm. The heavy machine gun tumbled down the slope in pieces. The gunner was simply gone, translated from flesh to memory in the span of a heartbeat. Marcus pulled up hard and immediately knew something was very wrong. The stick felt dead in his hands, hydraulic pressure dropping toward zero. He'd taken more hits, critical hits, shots that had severed lines and destroyed actuators. The A-10 was still flying but barely responding, like trying to steer a truck with no power steering. Warning lights cascaded across his panel: hydraulic failure, flight control degradation, engine fire warning on the right turbofan. The aircraft shuddered and rolled left, trying to swap ends. "Reaper 1, you're on fire. Your right engine is burning." Marcus reached for the fire suppression, pulled the T-handle, felt the extinguisher discharge. The warning light flickered but didn't extinguish. The engine was dying, thermal damage probably catastrophic. He secured it, shut down fuel and electrical, converted to single-engine flight. The Warthog could fly on one engine. It could fly with half a wing missing. But it couldn't fly without hydraulics, and he was down to emergency reserves. Sabre 2-6, Reaper 1, I've completed the mission. Area is clear for your extraction. I'm egressing north. Reaper 1, we've got QRF inbound, Chinooks with Apache escort. ETA 4 minutes. Can you maintain station? Marcus looked at his gauges, doing the math that every pilot dreads. Fuel at 40% and still leaking. One engine dead. Hydraulics nearly gone. He was 60 miles from Bagram, separated from base by some of the most unforgiving terrain on Earth. The aircraft was dying under him by degrees, systems cascading into failure, and he had maybe 10 minutes of controllable flight remaining if he was lucky. Negative, Sabre 2-6. I need to get this bird home while I still can. Good luck down there. Reaper 1, on behalf of all of us, thank you, you saved our lives. Marcus didn't respond. He was already nursing the crippled Warthog around, pointing the nose toward Bagram, trying to coax altitude from an aircraft that wanted to fall. The mountains rose around him like the walls of a cathedral, beautiful and merciless, and he began the long, wounded flight toward home. The first 10 minutes were manageable. Marcus climbed to 8,000 feet, trading precious fuel for altitude, giving himself room to glide if the remaining engine quit. The A-10 responded to his inputs but sluggishly, each control movement requiring anticipation and gentle pressure. The emergency hydraulic system was down to 20%, and when it reached zero, He'd be flying with manual reversion direct cable control to the flight surfaces, which meant the aircraft would handle like a freight truck with no brakes. His radio crackled. "Reaper 1, Bagram Tower, we've been monitoring your situation. Crash crews are standing by. What's your fuel state?" "Tower, Reaper 1, fuel at 32% and falling. Estimate 20 minutes to base at current consumption rate." He didn't mention that he'd need at least 25 minutes to cover the distance, or that his hydraulics wouldn't last 15. No point in sharing problems he couldn't solve. "Reaper 1, recommend you consider ejection and let the aircraft go. You've done your job." Marcus looked down at the mountains passing below, at the photograph of his daughters taped to his panel, at the scarred and battered cockpit that had kept him alive through 100 missions. He thought about the maintainers who'd worked through the night to load his weapons, about the young crew chief who'd saluted him before takeoff, about the taxpayers who'd paid $60 million for this aircraft. He thought about going home in a helicopter, leaving 30 tons of warthog scattered across the Hindu Kush like so much expensive litter. "Tower negative, I'm bringing her home." There was a pause then. "Understood, Reaper 1, will be waiting." 15 minutes out, the hydraulic pressure hit zero. Marcus felt the stick go heavy in his hands, felt the aircraft's response become a negotiation rather than an obedience. He was flying manual reversion now, using raw muscle and trim tabs to keep the warthog level, every input a calculated guess. The fuel gauge showed 18%. The mountains were beginning to recede, replaced by the desert flats that surrounded Bagram. So close now, close enough to see it end. Then the master caution lit up again, and Marcus knew before he looked at the gauge. Fuel transfer failure. The leak had finally found the main tank, and now his remaining fuel was hemorrhaging into the Afghan air. He watched the gauge needle swing downward like a clock counting down his life. 15%, 12, 10. At 6%, the low fuel warning began to chime, a gentle, insistent tone that said you have maybe 3 minutes before you become a glider. "Tower, Reaper 1, I've got a fuel emergency. I'm not going to make the field." "Reaper 1, we can bring the arrestment gear onto the approach end, give you extra runway. Can you stretch it?" Marcus did the math. He was 8 miles out, altitude 4,000 feet, fuel dropping through 4%. The single remaining engine was gulping fuel faster than his leaking tanks could provide. He could maybe make the airfield boundary, could maybe touch down on the dirt access road before the runway. Or he could punch out right now and watch the Warthog auger in, mission complete, pilot safe, aircraft destroyed. His hand moved to the ejection handle, then stopped. Emma and Sophie's faces looked at him from the photograph. They'd already lost their mother. What would it teach them if their father quit when things got hard? What legacy was he building? That when the mission gets tough, you abandon the machine that saved your life. The A-10 had protected him, had taken the bullets meant for his body, had kept flying when any other aircraft would have quit, and he was going to abandon her like trash. Marcus's jaw set. His hand moved back to the throttle. "Tower, Reaper 1, tell the crash crews to roll. I'm coming in hot." The fuel gauge hit 2% when Bagram's runway appeared on the horizon, a black ribbon wavering in the heat shimmer. Marcus began his approach, gear down and locked, flaps no, flaps wouldn't extend, hydraulics dead. He'd be landing fast, no drag devices, no margin for error. The runway was 10,000 feet long, but he'd be landing with the glide characteristics of a brick. One chance to get this right. 1% fuel. The runway was coming up fast now. Marcus could see the fire trucks lining the taxiway, the ambulances standing by, the tiny figures of men watching the sky. The engine coughed once, twice, fuel starvation imminent. He milked the throttle, coaxing the last drops from dying tanks, trading every second of thrust for precious distance. 500 feet altitude. The runway threshold passed beneath him. The engine coughed again and died. In the sudden silence, Marcus heard his own breathing, heard the wind rushing past the canopy, heard the airframe groan under stress it was never designed to handle. The Warthog was a glider now, 30 tons of metal and titanium arcing toward the ground with mathematical inevitability. He pulled the nose up slightly, bleeding off speed, trying to stretch the glide. The runway stretched ahead, tantalizingly close. 200 feet, 100, the desert floor rising to meet him. The A-10 hit the dirt access road 50 feet short of the runway, main gear first, impact hard enough to compress the landing struts to their limits. Marcus yanked back on the stick, keeping the nose high, letting the aircraft settle. The nose gear touched down and the Warthog bounced, skipped, found the runway threshold and rolled onto the prepared surface. No brakes, no thrust reversers, just momentum and friction and prayer. Marcus stood on the useless brake pedals anyway, holding the stick back, watching the numbers count down 8,000 feet remaining, 7,006. The aircraft finally rolled to a stop with 1,500 feet of runway remaining. Marcus sat in the cockpit, hands still on the controls, breathing hard, watching the fire trucks race toward him with foam systems armed. Around the airfield, personnel were climbing out of hardened bunkers, emerging from protective positions, staring at the crippled A-10 that had somehow clawed its way home. The right engine was charred black. The left wing looked like Swiss cheese. Hydraulic fluid dripped from a dozen punctures. It was the most beautiful wreckage anyone had ever seen. The fire chief appeared at his cockpit, hand raised in a thumbs up, asking if he was okay. Marcus nodded, suddenly exhausted, feeling the adrenaline drain away and leave something fragile in its place. He began the shutdown checklist, or what remained of it since half his systems were already dead. When he finally popped the canopy and climbed down the ladder, his legs nearly gave out. The ground felt strange, solid, permanent in a way that air could never be. The maintenance crew chief approached him, a young sergeant with wide eyes walking around the aircraft in disbelief. "Sir, I mean this bird is destroyed. How did you even fly it back?" Marcus looked at the A-10, at the battle damage that should have killed him a dozen times over, at the tough, homely aircraft that had refused to quit even when death was certain. "She flew herself, Sergeant. I was just along for the ride." Within an hour, the story was spreading through Bagram. The single father pilot who'd flown into the throat of God. The A-10 that wouldn't die. The 12 Navy SEALs who'd been extracted safely from the valley, who were telling anyone who'd listen about the Warthog driver who'd turned the battle single-handedly. The combat footage from the valley's drones was already being reviewed by commanders, the gun camera footage showing the precision of Marcus's attacks, the calculated risk of each pass. Someone counted the hits on his aircraft, 37 separate impacts, any one of which could have been fatal in a less robust plane. In the debriefing room, the air mission commander listened to Marcus's after-action report with an expression that never changed. When Marcus finished, the commander stood, walked around the desk, and did something that shocked everyone in the room. He saluted. Not the casual salute of military courtesy, but a slow, formal acknowledgement that held for 3 full seconds. Marcus returned it, confused. "Captain Kine, what you did today was beyond exceptional. It was the kind of flying that defines careers, that gets written into textbooks. I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. You saved 12 lives at tremendous personal risk." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Sir, with respect, I was just doing my job. Any pilot would have." "No, Captain," the commander's voice was firm. "Not any pilot. Most pilots would have turned back when they saw the anti-aircraft fire. Some would have made one pass and called it quits. You stayed until the mission was complete, then brought your aircraft home against impossible odds. That's not standard operating procedure. That's heroism." The room was quiet. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the attention, with the way people were looking at him like he'd done something extraordinary when he'd only done what was necessary. "Sir, the A-10 did most of the work. I just pointed it in the right direction." The commander smiled faintly. "The A-10 is a machine, Captain. What happened today required a human being to make impossible choices under extreme stress. That was you." After the debriefing, Marcus walked back to his quarters in the gathering dusk, watching the sun set over the Hindu Kush mountains that had tried so hard to kill him. His body ached, his hands trembled with delayed shock, and all he wanted was to call home and hear his daughter's voices. But it was 3 a.m. in Virginia, and they'd be sleeping, dreaming whatever 7-year-olds dream about. So he sat on his bunk and wrote them a letter instead, trying to explain where he'd been today without explaining what he'd actually done. Trying to tell them he loved them without admitting how close he'd come to never saying it again. The next morning, something changed at Bagram. When Marcus walked to the flight line for his debrief with the maintenance team, personnel stopped what they were doing, saluted. Not the casual morning greeting, but the real thing, the kind reserved for people who'd earned something beyond rank. He didn't understand it at first. Then he saw the maintenance crews gathered around the damaged A-10, saw them touching the airframe like it was something sacred, saw the way they looked at him. The crew chief who'd serviced his aircraft before the mission approached him, eyes bright. "Sir, we've been working on her all night, want to show you something." He led Marcus around the port wing to where a cluster of impact holes formed an almost perfect constellation. That's 7 hits in a 2-foot circle. Any one of them hits 6 inches higher, they sever your hydraulic lines completely. You lose all control and spin in. Marcus studied the damage, the narrow margin between survival and death written in torn metal. Luck. No, sir. The crew chief's voice was firm. Skill. You were jinking, evading, keeping the aircraft moving. You made yourself a hard target while still prosecuting the mission. That's why you're alive. They walked around the aircraft together, cataloging the damage. 37 hits total. Right engine destroyed, would need complete replacement. Left wing showing stress fractures, would need structural repair. Hydraulic system gutted, fuel system compromised, flight control cables severed. The A-10 would be in maintenance for weeks, maybe months, but she'd fly again. The Warthog always flew again. As they worked, other pilots started showing up. The ones who'd requested transfers from Reaper's wing. The ones who'd called him reckless, who'd whispered that he had a death wish, who'd avoided flying with him. They stood at a distance, watching the damage assessment, and something in their expressions had changed. One of them, a cocky F-16 driver named Halston, who'd once said the A-10 was for pilots who couldn't handle real fighters, approached slowly. "Captain Kine, I owe you an apology." Marcus looked at him, saying nothing. Halston continued, words coming hard. "I watched the drone footage from yesterday. The way you flew into that valley, the precision of your attacks. That was some of the finest combat aviation I've ever seen. And I've been running my mouth about the A-10, about close air support, like I knew what I was talking about. I was wrong. You're not a washout. You're exactly where you're supposed to be." Marcus studied the younger pilot, seeing his own past in Halston's face, the arrogance of youth, the certainty that speed and altitude made you better. "The A-10 isn't sexy," he said quietly. "It's not going to break any records. But when American lives are on the line, when someone needs help right now, it's the only bird that can do the job. I didn't wash out of fighters. I found my calling." Halston nodded slowly, and something like respect settled between them. Other pilots moved closer, listening. Marcus continued, speaking to all of them now. "Every aircraft has a mission. The F-16 owns the sky. The F-15 rules beyond visual range. The Raptor is a ghost that kills before you know it's there. But the A-10, we live in the dirt with the infantry. We get shot at by everything with a trigger. And we keep coming back because those men on the ground are counting on us. That's not consolation prize flying. That's the purest form of the mission." The words hung in the morning air, and pilots who dismissed him for years heard them differently now. Because rhetoric was just words, but yesterday's mission was proof written in torn metal and saved lives. Over the next week, the story spread beyond Bagram. The 12 Navy SEALs who'd been extracted from the valley made sure of it. They visited Marcus's squadron, brought him a plaque with their team's insignia and a simple inscription, "To Reaper One, who answered the call." Their team leader, a grizzled master chief named Richardson, shook Marcus's hand with a grip that bordered on painful. "Captain, my men and I are alive because you were willing to do what no one else would. You flew into hell to pull us out. That's a debt we can never repay." Marcus was uncomfortable with the praise, with the weight of gratitude. "Master Chief, I was just Don't, Richardson's voice cut through. Don't minimize it. What you did required more than skill. It required accepting that you might not come home so that we could. That's the definition of valor. Own it. The Master Chief produced a bottle of bourbon, aged 15 years, expensive. This was supposed to be for when I retired. I want you to have it. Open it when you get home to your girls. Toast to the fact that 12 families still have their husbands and fathers and brothers. Marcus took the bottle, throat tight, and for the first time since the mission, felt the full weight of what had happened. 12 men, 12 families, all the birthdays and graduations and ordinary moments that would happen now because he'd been willing to risk everything. It was overwhelming. That night he finally called home. His daughters answered together, talking over each other in that way twins do, telling him about school and their friend's birthday party and how they'd made cookies that turned out weird. He listened to their voices and felt something crack in his chest, felt the fear he'd been holding at bay finally surface. He'd almost lost this, almost left them orphaned, almost made the same mistake as their mother, choosing duty or circumstance over being there. But he'd also saved 12 other families from that same grief. And wasn't that the weight every soldier carried? The impossible math of sacrifice, the question of whose life matters more, the knowledge that sometimes the right choice was also the hardest. When his daughters asked what he'd been doing, Marcus looked at the bottle of bourbon sitting on his shelf and said simply, helping some friends who needed it, nothing special. Emma, wise beyond her years, said, Daddy, you always say that, but I bet it was special. He smiled, tears burning behind his eyes. Maybe a little bit, sweetheart, maybe a little bit. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony happened 3 weeks later in Bagram's operations center. The base commander personally pinned the medal to Marcus's chest, while 200 personnel stood at attention. The citation was read aloud, each word a clinical description of events that had been anything but clinical. For heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight, displayed exceptional courage and tactical expertise under heavy enemy fire, saved 12 friendly personnel from certain death through superior airmanship and devotion to duty. Marcus stood at attention and felt like a fraud. He'd done his job. He'd used the skills the Air Force had trained him in. He'd trusted his aircraft and completed the mission. Where was the heroism in that? But looking at the faces around him, the SEALs who'd flown up from Kandahar to attend, the maintainers who'd rebuilt his aircraft, the pilots who'd changed their minds about him, he began to understand something deeper. Heroism wasn't about doing impossible things. It was about doing necessary things when everyone else had decided they were impossible. It was showing up when the outcome was uncertain and the cost was high. It was being the person who answered the call when the call came, even knowing you might not survive it. Not because you were special or brave or gifted, but because someone had to, and you were there. After the ceremony, the base commander pulled him aside, voice low and serious. Marcus, I've been flying for 28 years. I've seen a lot of missions, a lot of combat. What you did in that valley was textbook perfect execution under the worst possible conditions. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Marcus met his eyes. Sir. When you were flying back, when your fuel was gone and your hydraulics were dead, why didn't you eject? You could have punched out, let the aircraft crash, gone home clean. Why risk everything for a machine? Marcus thought about it, trying to find words for something he'd only felt. Sir, that machine kept me alive through the mission. It took bullets meant for me. It flew when it should have fallen apart. Abandoning it felt like leaving a wingman behind. And I couldn't do that, not after everything we'd been through together. The commander studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's what I thought. You know what that makes you, Captain? An anachronism. A throwback to an earlier era when pilots had relationships with their aircraft, when flying was as much about trust as skill. The Air Force has been trying to breed that out of pilots for decades, turn them into interchangeable parts. But you're one of the old ones, and that's why you're so damn good. The words stayed with Marcus long after the ceremony